Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another 2018 Our Homes, Our Votes campaign webinar here at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. My name is Justin Goddard, and I serve as a housing advocacy organizer here at the Coalition. In anticipation of this year's elections, we're conducting a series of 6 webinars to provide clear information to assist organizations looking to engage low-income renters in the electoral process. We believe that showing elected officials that housing is an important elections issue will be essential to advancing policy at the federal, state, and local levels. Before we get started, I'd like to take a quick moment to go over a few logistical details for today's webinar. We will allow time for questions at the end of today's presentation. If you have questions at any point, please type them into the Q&A box in your webinar browser. Access to both a video recording and presentation slides from today's webinar will be provided following today's event. Finally, should you experience any technical difficulties, please send an email to Lisa Marlowe at lmarlowe@nlihc.org. We're joined today by Joey Lindstrom and Annie Liampora. Joey is the manager for field organizing here at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and works with partners across the nation to organize efforts on low-income housing issues. Annie is a grassroots analyst for the National Coalition for the Homeless and develops their mobilization strategies and policies. On the agenda for today's webinar, we'll begin with discussion of things to think about beforehand, give an overview of voter registration strategies, share tips for an effective registration campaign, discuss common obstacles, and close by responding to questions and highlighting additional resources. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joey.
All right, thanks so much for getting us started, Justin, and thanks to all of you for joining us today for this second in our 6-part webinar series exploring the key considerations for voter engagement for housing organizations. The Our Homes, Our Votes project is an effort by NLIHC to increase civic engagement and voter participation amongst low-income renters and their allies. And as you can see on this slide, we really think about voter engagement in 3 distinct phases: voter registration, voter education, and voter mobilization. Today we focus specifically on one of those 3 aspects, registration. Before we get started, I'd like to just review some key legal considerations for nonprofits, knowing that many of you are nonprofit organizations. Last week, in the first webinar of our series, we really went into great detail on what nonprofit organizations can and cannot do as it relates to elections. And I encourage many of you to watch the recording of that webinar if you weren't able to participate. But just as a review today, we hope that all of you, by participating, are at least interested in doing some form of voter engagement efforts. And we want you to feel confident knowing that you can, in fact, do so, and do so legally. Nonprofit organizations can register voters, can educate voters on issues and how to vote. Nonprofits can actually engage candidates and discuss the importance of housing in the process of the campaign debate. Nonprofits can engage in getting voters to the polls as long as all of these efforts remain strictly nonpartisan. And this means, obviously, that 501c3 organizations cannot make any endorsements of political candidates, cannot provide money or donations, but also resources or time to any candidate, and cannot have staff coordinating with candidates or political parties. Again, we've got a recording of a full sort of discussion of these issues, but I just wanted to mention that at the outset so that everybody on today's webinar feels comfortable that they can, in fact, legally participate in nonpartisan voter registration efforts. So let's discuss a few things that you might want to consider before you launch your voter registration campaign. First, you'll want to define your goals and then connect with the local board of elections. You'll consider registration trainings and resources to have available for a successful campaign. And let's break down each of those issues by itself. And first, let's take a moment and consider why we want to increase registration rates among low-income renters and their allies. If you look at this graph, this bar chart, it shows the disparity amongst registration rates between homeowners and renters over time. And what you'll see is that these numbers are pretty steady. You'll notice that registration rates are higher in every other year, and what you'll notice is that those are presidential years, 2008, 12, and 16. In the off-year elections, like this year, what we'll be having for midterm elections, the registration disparity between renters and homeowners is even greater. And in many ways, that means our efforts this year will be more important even than in a presidential year. So let's talk a bit about goal setting as you get started for voter registration. Number one, define your constituency. Who is it that your organization wants to register? Is it all of the homeless people who live in your shelter on any given night, or is it the low-income renters who live in the neighborhood that your community center serves? Are you an individual hoping to register just the neighbors in your particular building? Defining your constituency and figuring out who it is specifically you'd like to see registered is a key part of figuring out what your goals will be. After that, you'll want to pick a number. What do you think would constitute high turnout for that constituency? Do you want to get to 100% registration rates, or do you simply want to double the registration rates from the previous election? What is a number that you think you can get to based on the capacity of your organization? And on that topic of capacity of your organization, you'll want to consider what the roles will be for staff, volunteers, or if your board members will have a role in voter registration. Voter registration drives ultimately are also a great opportunity to recruit new volunteers to participate in your organization's work. These are volunteer roles that can be simple and easy to teach tactics and techniques that you can give for people who are just getting started in their engagement on housing issues. So the first thing to do after establishing what your goals are is to build a relationship with the local Board of Elections or county clerk's office. The local elected officials will have different names in different states, but for most of you, it'll be one of those two, county clerk or Board of Elections. Obviously, voter registration laws vary a great deal from state to state. There are some states that allow voter registration right up until Election Day. There are some states that have voter registration deadlines. Some states allow online registration and so forth. In order to figure out the particular registration laws for your state, we encourage you to use the nonprofit vote resource, Voting in Your State. And we include a URL at the bottom of this particular slide so that you can find their website and get a sense of what the laws are in your state and get a sense of who you need to reach out to. But we provide you not only with a URL, but on this next slide, an example. So I have selected voting in Minnesota as our example because both myself and our other presenter today hail from the land of 10,000 lakes. You'll see that nonprofit vote for each state in the union breaks down on the right-hand side of the page where you would find the state election office, the local election office, information about registering to vote, or if it's possible, registering to vote online. People can check their registration to make sure it's up to date, and then there's information about registering on Election Day. On the left-hand side of the page, you'll see that there are specific special circumstances, some for ex-offenders or previously convicted individuals. There's also voting and homelessness, which we'll get into later with Annie as our presenter there, and some other considerations in terms of disability accommodations, as well as absentee ballots for service members and so forth. But this is a really great resource that we encourage everyone to be able to take a look at. When conducting a registration drive, it's extremely important to train all volunteers and staff on the legal considerations of registration. There are some communities in some states where they might have rules saying that, for example, if a form is filled out, it needs to be returned to the county clerk's office within 72 hours. There are other places that will say a form is not valid unless it's signed. And different places will have different forms and sort of different requirements. So getting that information and making sure that all of the volunteers and staff participating know that they have all the details necessary to do effective registration. In some places, the local election officials will actually do these presentations and trainings for you, and they will actually deputize people as registrars to go throughout the community and collect registrations. So after voter registration, start considering what tools and resources you'll need to make available to have effective voter registration campaign. First, you'll always want to make sure you have enough voter registration forms. And if you're in a state that does online registration, you'll want to make sure that you have people who know how to use the website. Pledge cards can also be extremely important. Pledge cards are what connects registration to turnout, because many people register and then don't actually find their ways to the polls on election day. What pledge cards are sort of twofold purpose. One, so that your organization can save the contact information, email and phone of someone who's registered. And then secondarily, the pledge card will normally be mailed back to the person who has filled it out to remind them of their commitment to voting on election day. Many campaigns will use these pledge cards and attach the polling times and polling locations to the card when mailing it back to the voter who you may have registered. Providing sample ballots can sometimes be helpful, especially if you are working with a community or a population where a lot of people have never voted before. A sample ballot can sort of demystify the process of voting for people who might be intimidated by the prospect. And then additionally, just including some fact sheets on issues that are impacted by the election very often will help people realize that it's important to stand up and to participate as a registered voter. All right, so let's talk about registering voters, how it happens, and how you can include it in your day-to-day work. And day-to-day really is the best way to think of registration. If you run a service center, or if you're a housing provider and you have a community room, if you have bulletin boards, you really should be putting registration forms every single place you can think of. If you have a mailing list to residents or to neighbors, working registration forms or perhaps flyers about registering online into those mailings is extremely important. Now really is the time for you to start thinking of what are the day-to-day activities in which you can build in voter registration information. Beyond voter registration in your day-to-day work, you can plan specific events, voter registration parties, or perhaps Meet the Candidates event, where in addition to people coming in and talking about housing issues, they also fill out registration forms. Door-to-door obviously is a very effective way to register voters because you can, in that way, very tightly monitor your target audience. Are they in the neighborhood that you most specifically care about? Are they in the buildings that you're trying to organize? You should also establish community presence and be available at community events, fairs, assemblies with clipboards and forms, or with tablets and phones to do as much registration as you can. And finally, and I'll come back to this again, it's extremely important to keep records. Knowing who the voters are once you've registered them is how you will turn them out when we get to election day, and that'll be its own webinar in a couple of weeks. But knowing how to keep in touch with all of the voters is extremely important. Keeping records is also important to demonstrate that your efforts are having success and that you're building a large base of voters that elected officials and candidates should really care about in public conversation. Speaking specifically to planning a voter registration event, I'd like to draw your attention to National Voter Registration Day, which will be taking place on September 25th. This is a National Day of Coordinated Volunteer Events, and for a lot of people who want to volunteer on voter registration, they can go to the website and simply say, find an event. They put in their zip code, and then they know where to show up and be trained to work on voter registration. So any of the events that you have on this day can be populated up on that website, and it can help connect you with volunteers who would help out. Let's talk for a second about online voter registration, because I believe this is probably the third time I've done a version of this webinar here at NLIHC going back to 2014. And in that time, there's been a dramatic expansion of states that do some form of online voter registration. It's now up to 38 states. Through online voter registration, we can now make the process a lot more streamlined. It's not about collecting forms and then handing in forms. Voter registration now can be done by anybody who's got a smartphone and knows how to use the form. The League of Women Voters maintains a great online voter registration site at vote411.org. We've got the URL here at the bottom of your slide. And if someone finds their way to that URL or other online voter registration tools, and they are not in one of the 38 states that allows voter registration, what happens then is people put in their names and their addresses, and then they are automatically mailed a paper registration form through which they can complete the process. So it's a useful online tool regardless of whether or not your given state allows online voter registration. Updating registrations is something that's becoming increasingly important. On last week's webinar, Justin explored some increasingly disturbing trends in voter suppression, and one of those includes that voter rolls are being purged, which means if a voter is registered and hasn't participated in some cases in the last 3 or 4 elections, they will be removed from the voter rolls unless they re-register. It's additionally true that renters are more likely to move frequently and change their addresses, and thusly need to update their registration so that they can be appropriately assigned a different polling location. When in doubt, encourage people to re-register. I showed you the nonprofit vote, voting in your state resource earlier. That did include a function by which people can check their registration, which is very helpful and very important. But we really encourage people to re-register as often as possible because there are a lot of people who will show up on election day thinking they can vote as they have in the past and find that their name was removed from the voting rolls. It's a really disturbing tactic to decrease turnout, but we can fight back on that by just re-registering as many people as possible. Do consider, since we're talking about the high rate of change of occupancy and address for so many renters, do consider ordinances in your community whereby landlords can be required to provide voter registration information to all new tenants upon move-in. Minneapolis is the only city I'm aware of that actually has this particular ordinance, but it makes a lot of sense to address the disparity in registration rates between renters and homeowners. So those are some considerations for a registration campaign. And what we'll move into now is just tips for what will make your campaign most effective. There are some things that we've already addressed. Getting to know the election officials in your area will always be essentially important. But consider also building a coalition for your efforts. What you'll find is that the constituency that you serve, if it's a neighborhood or if you have, if you operate some subsidized properties, you'll find that that constituency is also served by other organizations in the community. And the overlapping efforts of the various service providers and advocacy groups throughout your community can really be impactful when driving up the rates of registration rates of low-income renters. Start planning right now for your voter registration efforts because in many states, registration deadlines are approaching. Many states have registration deadlines in mid-September, though most registration deadlines fall in October. Start recruiting volunteers and staff, and then additionally incorporate active tabling at events to the extent it's possible. Very often, as in the picture that I included on a slide earlier, people at events will have sort of a voter registration table where people can check on their registration or re-register. But a far better practice is to actually have people collecting registrations moving throughout the crowd, similar to what they might do in a door-to-door campaign, using the clipboard and the paper forms, using the tablets and the smartphones, and at as many events as possible, engaging with as many people as possible and ensuring that they're registered. I'll remind you when it comes to effectiveness, the importance of tracking your progress when doing your registration drives. Next slide, please. Tracking progress will be extremely important for getting the attention of candidates and elected officials, and then holding them to the pledges that they make on housing issues throughout the campaign. So at this point, this all sounds like pretty common sense information for an effective campaign, but there are a lot of things that can get in the way, and we'll address a few of those under common obstacles. First, I'd like to talk about voter apathy, and then chat a little bit about the prevalence of locked apartment buildings and how that can be difficult for a door-to-door registration campaign. We'll talk about formerly incarcerated voters, and then we'll focus on voting without an address for people who currently have no home and who might be a target of your particular voter registration efforts. So first, let's talk about voter apathy. When we're working with low-income communities, this is extremely common, and it's not hard to understand why. So many people have seen so many elections come and go, and very little change happen as a result. This is especially true for low-income people who struggle day to day and find it difficult to accept the promises they hear from candidates. There's very effective messaging that can confront voter apathy, and the best approach is to focus on voting as a means to a better future or a different path forward. Connecting voting with the struggles of an individual voter can be very effective. If it's a voter who relies upon particular subsidy programs, or even if it's a voter who has family that might be retired or someone with a disability, or they know someone who's low income, connecting those personal stories to the policies in play is extremely important for confronting apathy. And then using language that refers to duty, reminding people that this is a sort of opportunity for them to step up and sort of have their voice heard in the process of how their community will move forward. I include on this slide one of my all-time favorite posters, which is from a community health vote effort in Massachusetts. And it's a really simple picture of obviously an adorable child, and then I can't vote, but you can vote for me. And I really feel like this is effective because it carries that sense of civic duty and obligation for people to think of voting as a selfless act that they do for their entire community and not just themselves. So obviously, because so many of us will be working to increase registration rates among renters, we'll be going door to door, and we'll confront the constant problem of locked apartment buildings. The first thing you should know is that voter registration is not considered soliciting. You'll see many apartment buildings that have just sort of a blanket no soliciting policy, but civic engagement is not soliciting, and there are various court decisions that have established that over time. It's also true that many or even most owners and operators of locked apartment buildings will allow nonpartisan door-to-door registration when it's requested in advance. So if there is in your neighborhood a set of apartments that you obviously can't go in door to door because it's always locked, send a letter in advance. Try to pick a weekend in which your volunteers can go in and go door to door with registration forms and have the conversations with neighbors about the importance of voting. Remember, though, also, neighbors can always engage neighbors. So if your organization knows people in these particular buildings, you can pair with someone who is a current occupant or a current renter, and they can go with you and sort of just do a lot of that door-to-door work. Also on the topic of locked apartment buildings, you might be wondering where to find subsidized residents, subsidized housing residents in your community. And we encourage you to use the National Housing Preservation Database produced by NLIHC and our partners at PARC. This can be found at preservationdatabase.org, and we've included on here an example of using Minneapolis as our favorite community for today's webinar, just sort of where there are tax credit properties that obviously involve many low-income renters who might be interested in making sure these programs continue to exist moving forward. Now, next week, we're going to do a much more expansive exploration of this topic, how to use the Housing Preservation Database to find subsidized properties, as well as how to keep lists of voters and low-income voters in order to more precisely target who to reach out to with your registration efforts. Voting for formerly incarcerated individuals, this is a really common misunderstanding. People feel like if they've ever been convicted of a felony, they just can't vote. And I'm here to tell you that's not true. Generally, a person with a conviction who has completed all parole and probation, or if you often hear the term people who are off paper, if they're not on paper anymore, they are eligible to vote, but this varies by state. In the next bullet point, I point out the 4 states where anyone with a felony conviction is permanently banned from voting, and those are Florida, Virginia, Kentucky, and Iowa. There are only 2 states on the opposite side of the spectrum that allow people with convictions to vote while they are still imprisoned, and those are Vermont and Maine. The ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, maintains a great map resource for finding out what the laws are in your state regarding criminal convictions and voting, and you can find that at the URL at the bottom of your page. This is another question that's answered at nonprofitvote.org when you go to voting in your state. That's another resource there. So having discussed all of that, I'm going to turn it over to Annie Lampora from the National Coalition for the Homeless to discuss some of their efforts with regard to people who vote without an address.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Joey, and the National Low Income Housing Coalition for hosting this webinar and inviting us to be a part of it. So NCH created a manual and a campaign called You Do Not Need a Home to Vote. This campaign seeks to promote voting access for low-income and homeless persons to ensure that people who are economically disadvantaged maintain a voice in shaping their future. So as Joey mentioned before in last week's webinar, a lot of questions that we get are around 501c3s and their roles. So I'm just going to skip over that. And if you have any other questions, please go back to the webinar that the National Low Income Housing Coalition did, and hopefully all those questions will be answered. But when it comes to people actually experiencing homelessness, we get calls all the time around this time of year about, hey, I'm homeless, I don't have a permanent address, I want to vote, can I still vote? And the answer is always yes. Again, you do not need a home to vote. What does differ is by what is required by state for having an address, and this varies. And right now we're currently updating the requirements, and hopefully in the next coming weeks we will have that posted on our website at nationalhomeless.org about those requirements. But let me just do a little quick overview. So some states will require shelter address or a description of a general location at which the individual usually spends their night, such as off of Pennsylvania Avenue, or even a drawn map. Really what the address is really meant to do is to funnel people to the polling sites and having mailing election info. Moving on to misconceptions. There's a lot of misconceptions that homeless individuals are not interested in politics or interested in voting. And what we have found is that 70% of those registered to vote by volunteer voter outreach program actually go to the polls on presidential elections. As we know, this is a midterm, so it's a little different, but hopefully we can not only make it to 70%, but exceed 70% of our low-income individuals. Some tips, Joey has talked about day-to-day work. So this is a great way for shelters, drop-in centers, food pantries, and soup kitchens, even outreach programs, to, on a day-to-day basis, through intake or exit interviews, to register people to vote. At the same time, if people are hesitant about voting, you can ask them questions about why are you hesitant. You can educate them about the process of voting. But again, you have to remember to remain nonpartisan. And I think what is really important here is that you go to where your clients are. As people in the homeless service industry know, a lot of people are not able-bodied. So if your clientele is more outside, go to them through your outreach programs. If more of your clientele is through the shelter system, go into the shelters, set up a voter registration drive within the shelter system. If your nonprofit runs an affordable housing development, you can organize a door-to-door voter registration drive as well. Again, promote voter education through community meetings and candidate forums, and again, educate your clients on why it's important to vote. And the last thing I just want to talk about is what else can your organization do during this time? One huge thing is to let your clients use your agency as a mailing address. You can call your city or county election offices and find out if your agency can become a polling site on election day. organize a candidate forum, or if there's already a candidate forum happening, provide the transportation for your clients to go to the forum and hear from the clients. But that's all for me, and if you have any more questions, please don't hesitate to go to nationalhomeless.org.
Okay, thanks so much, Annie. So that was a lot of information we just gave you over the last half hour. We'd like to give you an opportunity now to ask questions, which you can type into the questions bar on the right-hand side of the screen. And I believe Lisa Marlowe is monitoring our questions queue right now. Lisa, do we have any questions to answer?
Yeah, we have a couple. The first one is if you could just please share again where we can get voter registration applications for new renters.
So getting the actual registration applications will be almost always from some county official, whether that's called the county clerk or the board of elections. So you can find that by going to nonprofitvote.org, clicking on voting in your state, and then it'll say local election office. And looking up the local election office for your community, contacting them and getting the forms will be the best way to do it, because obviously, as you might expect, forms will vary location by location.
Can you please share any tips for keeping records when using online voter registration? How can you keep track of info for GOTV using electronic forms?
So that's an excellent question, and there are a lot of online voter registration tools that have started to think about this. So Rock the Vote is an organization that helps nonprofits kind of build their own online registration app. And when you sort of build your own online registration app, you can have it function in various ways where there's information that's for the form, and then there's additional information that's requested, right? And the additional information can be email address or phone number, which is almost never asked for on a registration form. And then it can be set up also such that there's a box one can check to share the information of their registration with you. So that can happen through electronically in a couple of different ways. There are different states that have different sort of rules and protocols. So again, having that relationship with election officials is extremely important. I would also say that this is one way in which in many places paper registrations are better, because in most places, not everywhere, it is legal to copy the registration form, make a photocopy of it, before handing it in, and that way you can keep track of the addresses of everyone you register.
Do apartment, mobile home, park management offices have the right to refuse door-to-door voter registration efforts?
So that actually seems extremely clear to me because mobile home parks have street-facing doors and addresses. And there is, in fact, Supreme Court decisions that establish that not only just voter registration, but also if somebody was going throughout the community with a petition, that has to be allowed as well. That's protected under free speech. And there's a lot of case law that establishes that. So unless there, maybe they could try to make some argument that in order to get to the public street, someone has to pass through like privately controlled property. Maybe there's some really technical way that they could try to get around it. But I think what people should just know is that there is Supreme Court case law that establishes that this is not soliciting, and anyone with a street-facing door, they cannot ban voter registration. The only reason they can keep voter registration out of locked apartment buildings is the interior hallways are not sort of street facing, and as a result, they can declare that as sort of shared space or the space of the property manager and not the space of the renter, and it's access to that space that they can restrict. So a mobile home park should not be similar in any way.
So many people living in low-income housing are immigrants and aren't fluent in English. How would you suggest mitigating the language barrier if you come across someone who you can't fluently communicate with?
So that's an excellent question, and thanks for bringing that up. Most places will have voter registration forms available in multiple languages, and that varies from state to state or even county to county. I worked on a pretty massive registration campaign in Colorado in 2012, and I worked in a section of Colorado where there was a very large Spanish-speaking population, and all of the counties I worked in had registration forms in Spanish. That was not true throughout the entire state. Again, having that relationship with local election officials will be the best way to get the materials in another language. In terms of actually engaging with these voters and helping them get registered, the best way is to identify leaders in those communities, in those immigrant communities who have the same language abilities, and can work to overcome any sort of fears or intimidation someone might feel about participating in this process. Recruiting volunteers, again, is a really essential part of this process, and having diverse volunteers with diverse language abilities really makes a voter registration campaign more successful.
Can you please share some ways to get new housing measures on state ballots?
Oh, yeah. So that's really interesting. That's something that we'll probably cover a bit in our voter education webinar, which will be coming up on August 14th. Many states don't allow direct legislation and ballot initiatives. The states that do always require a certain amount of signatures to be collected in order to place the measure on the ballot, or that it be passed by a legislature to be put before the voters. And so 2 years ago, we actually had a lot of housing-related ballot initiatives passed. There were some big ones in the Bay Area of California, Charlotte, North Carolina, Detroit, Michigan had one. There were some really important, especially funding affordable housing efforts on the ballot. And in California, there were a bunch of rent control ordinances that passed as well. So the process for getting a question on the ballot usually involves first forming a ballot committee that's registered with the local board of elections. That committee then needs to get the question that will be posed to voters drafted and approved, and then circulate petitions for signatures that actually have on the petition the actual question, so everyone knows sort of what they're asking to have put on the ballot. Different communities will have different thresholds for how many petitions are needed. And as I mentioned, another option is to go directly to legislators who might say, you know, we don't feel comfortable passing this law ourselves, but we feel comfortable putting it to voters to see if they'll pass it. So there are a couple of different ways to do that. Because not every state can do a ballot initiative, it's not something that we've focused on to this point with our materials, though we might develop a training on that in the future. I would refer you for now to www.boulderadvocacy.org. Boulder Advocacy is a project of the Alliance for Justice, and they have a lot of really good recommendations on what is important for ballot initiatives. And they provided our guest presenter for last week's webinar as well. So they really know their stuff when it comes to the legal considerations.
Can a formerly incarcerated person from one of the states that Annie mentioned earlier, can they vote in another state?
I think so.
So a person can only vote at one address. Obviously, it's one person, one vote. So if it's a situation where a person, let's imagine a person who is homeless in Kansas City, and perhaps they frequently stay at a shelter in Kansas City, Kansas, but every now and then they crash on a friend's couch in Kansas City, Missouri. And they have differing laws for how someone is treated when they have a conviction. Yeah, sure. That person, just like any other person with multiple residences, can pick which residence they want to be registered at. The key consideration is they really just have to pick one and sort of, stick with it and not try to do multiples in any given election, of course.
Yeah, that seems right.
Other questions?
Yes. What is NLIC's strategy to include Southern states in this Our Homes, Our Votes initiative, specifically in the Mississippi Delta and other poor rural communities? They're having difficulty attracting certified qualified teachers due to the lack of decent housing. So what is NLIC's strategy in including Southern states in this initiative?
I would say Our Homes, Our Votes, much like all of our other projects, is something that we do really for everyone in our network. As a national organization, we don't, with the exception of some of our projects, like, for example, disaster housing recovery. Recently, we focused a lot on Florida and Texas and Puerto Rico and so forth. But for something like Our Homes, Our Votes, what we do is we make the tools available and we encourage advocates to use them the best that they can. We haven't yet acquired any funding that would allow us to identify places where this particular project is most important and then do the necessary technical assistance and one-on-one training. That actually would be great if we could do that. For right now, we make the information available to everybody, pretty evenly. And if there are questions that this attendee has about how our tools can be used in the Mississippi Delta, I would love to have an opportunity to connect. And one of the slides at the end will be contact information for us. And everyone should always feel comfortable reaching out, asking questions, and then we can kind of help troubleshoot what's going on in your given community. And I will mention Justin Goddard on our field team covers Louisiana and Mississippi for his geography, and he would be probably the best liaison to reach out to for that region. I don't know if you anything.
No.
Any other questions?
Yes. Can you share any best practices for engaging communities of color and immigrant communities in the GOTV practice?
Yeah, I think, Get Out the Vote is a little bit different than voter registration. I think all of the strategies that we shared today are important for really sort of all low-income renters. And I think many of you who are organizers know that people who are low-income, often that overlaps a great deal with people of color. I will say, as many of you know, if you've been doing organizing, that the best way to engage someone is with someone who's sort of from their community. And sometimes one of the biggest vulnerabilities for campaigns is when they bring in people from out of state or out of town to do all the voter registration. It just doesn't come off as relevant and urgent like it would when it comes from someone with their community. So to me, the best practice to be effective in voter registration and get out the vote is to make sure that your giving campaign is recruiting broadly from the impacted communities and then training volunteers and staff and leaders to do the actual voter registration work, and then providing financial resources if they're available. I know that's pretty rare in most cases, to actually hire some people to do registration and so forth. I think the best approach is to do effective recruitment and in some cases also targeted materials. Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California worked extremely hard recently and is working extremely hard right now on some ballot initiatives in the Bay Area. And they produced their information in support of the ballot initiative in, I'm going off of memory, I want to say it was something like 12 or 13 different languages for their materials, so that the renters that they were engaging weren't just English-speaking renters. They were voters of all different languages. And they made sure that their materials accounted for that. So I think materials and sort of language justice within materials is extremely important, as well as being mindful of who is carrying the message of the importance of voting, the importance of turning out to the polls on election day. So that recruitment, I think, is pretty essential. Do you have anything?
No, that sounds great.
So we just have one last question, and it's just actually just if you could share again how people can register when they're unstably housed or have difficulty proving residency.
Yeah, again, you can go to nationalhomeless.org. Right now on our website, we have it broken up by state, what is required for addresses, if you even do need an address. But I think one of the best ways, if a client or clienteles are not within the shelter system or through intake or outtake processes, go use an outreach team. Go find these clienteles, talk to them about voter registration, and make sure you understand your law. But we have everything on the books right now on our website. And again, we are going to hopefully be updating our website with this new round of voter ID laws and address requirements in the next 2 weeks. But also, if you have any more questions, please don't hesitate to call our office at any time, and be happy to talk with you at length about this as well.
So I think that's all the questions that we have.
Well, that was quite a robust list of questions, and they were all great. So thanks so much. So feel free to continue to add questions. We'll return to questions really briefly because it looks like we've got some time. I'd like to highlight a couple of additional resources. One is the voter engagement tools that NLIHC produces. We've got the Our Homes, Our Votes voter engagement guide, which discusses a lot of the considerations that we've gone over with you here today, as well as many others in voter education and getting out the vote. And then also our voter engagement plan, which is a step-by-step process. And you'll see on the image provided on the slides, there are checklists and there are questions, what percentage of your clients will you register, what number, and so forth. And it kind of takes you step by step through what a good plan will look like for your organization or for your neighborhood. As we mentioned earlier, this is the second in a series of 6 webinars. And so there's 4 more coming up. They're all at the same time, all 3 o'clock Eastern on Tuesdays. So the upcoming Tuesdays will include next week the importance of voter lists, a key tool for successful mobilization. And that's sort of how I was talking about, we want to be able to track who our voters are, who the low-income renters are, if they're registered, where their polling location is. This is really important for getting people to turn out in high numbers. On August 7th, we're going to talk about an informed debate and engaging candidates on housing issues while still remaining nonpartisan, and getting candidates to actually talk about our issues while they're campaigning. Because if you think about it, so often in the national conversation, housing just isn't addressed. On Tuesday, August 14th, I vote for more affordable homes, educating voters before Election Day. What can we do to make sure voters have information about the candidates, where they stand on housing issues, and then also information that's more simple in terms of where is your polling location? When is it open? What is your best path to get there? What do you need to bring with you? What happens if you're challenged at a polling location? What is a provisional ballot? And we'll sort of talk about how we educate voters, partly about the issues and the candidates, and then partly about voting to make sure that they feel empowered to actually turn out to vote. And speaking of turning out to vote, that's August 21st. Where we'll explore methods to make sure people come to the polls in robust numbers, campaigns to transport people to the polls, making sure that our campaigns are connecting all of the people we've registered and educated and getting them to turn out on Election Day. I'd like to remind all of you that NLIHC is a membership organization, and efforts like Our Homes, Our Votes aren't funded by any particular foundation or anything. It's something that we can only do because of the strength of our members throughout the country. So please consider joining NLIHC today. The last slide is a very important one. This includes contact information for myself and Annie. I actually see the phone numbers and emails aren't here, so I'm going to throw those out. For me, I'm at 202-507-7441, and my email is jlindstrom@nlihc.org. Annie, do you want to go?
And our phone number is 202-462-4822, and my email is alienpora@nationalhomeless.org.
So for those of you who weren't quickly scribbling out the contact information Andy and I just gave, that's totally fine. We're going to add that information to the slide and make sure that when we send out the slides and the recording after this webinar is complete, that information will be included. But one of the things that you heard Annie and myself say about any of your questions that got pretty technical or pretty detailed is that we're available to help, and we're available to troubleshoot what you're working on in your community. So please don't hesitate to reach out. So with that, I would like to ask Lisa if we've got any more questions that have come in.
No, that's it.
Okay, well, then I'd like to just say thank you again to Annie for being our co-presenter today.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of you for joining us for this webinar. Thank you for your efforts to increase voter registration rates of low-income renters. And I hope we're in touch again soon. See you for next week's webinar.
Thank you.